Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and we will be learning today Mi'at Hashem Daf Nun Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Netillas Yadayim. We pick up today on the very top line of Nun Amid Beis in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Kuf Nun Tes, and we are in middle of Siv Zayin. Now, we're up to the very top line of Nun Amid Beis, a couple of words in, by the words Vahani Mili. That's where we're up to. However, for the sake of context, I'm going to read the words of the Mechaber just from the very beginning of Siv Zayin. I'm not going to go through the Mishnah Berurah. We covered that already. I'm going to speak some of the Mishnah Berurah outside, just what we need to understand. But we really do need to see from the beginning of Siv Zayin, just for context and for continuity. So, on Nun Amid Aleph, Siv Zayin, about halfway down in the Mechaber, says the Mechaber, Tzarech sheyavayu hamayim mikayach noisein. One of the main requirements of the Netillas Yadayim, we're going to see, is that we need kayach gavra. We need that the water, the Netillas Yadayim water, has to be poured onto the hands mikayach gavra, by the strength of a person. A person has to go pour the water from the keli onto the hands. Lefikach, therefore, since we have this requirement of kayach hanoisein, the kayach of the one pouring the water, lefikach, therefore, tzinar, if you have a pipe or a channel, lefikach, tzinar, shedoyla mayim min hayaor, where you draw water from the river. You have a bucket and you draw water from the river, v'shoifech bai, and now you take the water from the bucket and you pour it into the tzinar. You pour it into this half pipe, kind of, that creates a channel. And what's the purpose of all of this? V'shoifech bai, you pour the water into the channel, v'nimshachem mimenu hamayim, and the water flows down this channel, lahashkois hasadeh, and at the end it terminates by a field. And this is a device that's used to irrigate a field. So now, again, what do you have over here? You've got, let's say, a half pipe that goes from the Ya'ar, it goes from a lake, a river, a stream, and it goes, and it's meant to carry water and end at a field for irrigation purposes. How does the water get into the tzinar? You take a bucket, you dip it into the Ya'ar, and you pour it into the tzinar. Okay, says the Mechaber, in such a scenario, you cannot dunk your hands into the water in the tzinar, so that the water should flow over your hands. So what you're trying to accomplish over here is, you're trying to accomplish the Netillas Yadayim. Now, for the requirements of the Netillas Yadayim, you need a keli. Well, the bucket is a keli. So somebody took the bucket and filled it up with water from the Ya'ar, so you have water coming from a bucket. Now, you need kayach hanoisein. Well, a person is taking the bucket and he's pouring the water into the tzinar. How did the water get into the tzinar? The water got into the tzinar mikayach hanoisein. So now a person says to himself, okay, why can't I take my hands, dunk my hands into the tzinar, and let the water that came from a keli and it was poured into the tzinar, mikayach hanoisein, I'll let that water flow over my hands, and I'll accomplish the Netillas Yadayim in that way. Says the Mechaber, no, you can't do that. You cannot stick your hands into the water in the tzinar, thinking that you'll allow the water to flow over your hands and you'll accomplish the Netillas Yadayim. Why? Because the water that's going to flow over your hands is not flowing over your hands. Mikayach Adam. Shekvar pasak kayach hashayfech. The kayach of the one who poured the water into the tzinar, that's gone. He poured the water into the tzinar. The water landed in the tzinar. The fact that the water in the tziner continues to flow now, and it's going to flow and eventually terminate downstream in a field that needs irrigation, that is no longer considered to be happening mikayach hanoisein. The person who filled up the bucket and poured the water into the tzinar, his kayach put the water into the tzinar. Now that the water is in the tzinar, it's flowing based on gravity, and it's going to continue to flow downstream. And if this tzinar is pitched properly and it's very, very long, the water can even flow half a mile. But it's not flowing a half a mile away, mikayach hanoisein, from the kayach of the one who poured the water into the tzinar. The continuous flow is the kayach of gravity. It's not kayach adam. And therefore you cannot accomplish the tevilas yadayim because you're lacking this requirement of kayach adam. However, says the Mechaber, 3 lines off the bottom, v'immersing yadav karav limkai mashvicha. But if you insert your hands into the tzinar very close to the point where the pour from the bucket lands into the tzinar, and like the Mishnah Berurah says, you don't have to put your hands right under the pour. No, the pour from the bucket could land in the tzinar, and you place your hands in the water very close to where the water lands in the tzinar. In that case, says the Mechaber, v'immersing yadav karav limkai mashvicha, if you put your hands in the tzinar very close to where the pour from the bucket lands in the tzinar, then afal pi she'eda mesim tachas hashvicha mamish, even though you're not putting your hands mamish under the pour from the bucket, also like netila, you still accomplish the tevilas yadayim. Why? Because so long as your hands are close to the point where the water lands in the tzinar from the pour, that is called that the water came onto your hands mikayach hanoisein. That is considered that the flow over your hands is still from the kayach of the one who poured the water in the tzinar, because you're very close by. And, says the Mishnah Berurah, since you're very close to the point where the water is landing in the tzinar, you also gain the other requirement that the water has to come from a keli, right? Really, you're sticking your hands into the tzinar, the water is flowing over your hands, that's the water in the tzinar. How do you accomplish the tevilas yadayim? The tevilas yadayim has to be from a keli. Explains the Mishnah Berurah that by inserting your hands into the tzinar very close to where the pour lands in the tzinar, you're accomplishing 2 things. One is that's considered kayach hanoisein because it's very close to where he poured the water in, and you're also gaining the requirement of this is considered water that came from a keli, because again, you're very close to where the pour came into the tzinar. We still look at it as water that's coming from a keli. Okay, now we're up to the bottom line here on Nun Amud Aleph, and now I just want to make a very quick adjustment to my camera. This has been happening every time I shut my computer down and then restart it, and you notice that the camera goes out of focus a little bit, so let me just fix that. Okay, that should fix that problem. Okay, so now the Mishnah Berurah is really going to introduce to us a concept that we're going to spend more time with later on in this Siman. And that is, this is not very well known, and we have mentioned this a little bit already previously in this Siman, and that is the concept of tevilas yadayim. Tes veis yud lamed saf. Tevilas, as in being tovel in a mikveh. We know Netillas Yadayim. You take mayim in a keli and you pour it over your hands. Tevilas Yadayim is when you immerse your hands in water. Instead of pouring water over your hands, you're immersing your hands in water in order to be matahar them. Now, under certain circumstances, tevilas yadayim could work, so that you have your tuna fish sandwich, you don't have a keli, and you need some way to wash, under the right circumstances and in the right way, you could accomplish, so to speak, Netillas Yadayim. You could accomplish the goal of being matar your hands so that you can now go and eat bread. You could accomplish that goal with tevilas Yadayim, with immersing your hands in water. But there are a lot of requirements that go into that. And the discussion that we're going to have now is really revolving around the requirements of tevilas Yadayim. So now here on the bottom line of Nun Amud Aleph says the Mechaber as follows. Okay, so we have said that if you immerse your hands in the water of this tzinar, and you do it far away from the point at which the water was poured from the bucket into the tzinar, we said that you cannot accomplish the tevilas Yadayim. And we said, why is that? So really, there are two primary requirements of the tevilas Yadayim that are lacking. One is, it's not mikayach hanoisen. The water is flowing over your hands mikayach gravity. It's not flowing over your hands mikayach adam. So that's one problem. The other problem is, you don't have a keli. You're not getting the water over your hands from a keli. You're dunking and immersing your hands in the water that's in a tzinar. But you don't have Netillas Yadayim. You don't have water being poured onto your hands from a keli. That's what we've said until now. Now the Mechaber is introducing to us another concept. He says, but wait a second. Forget all of that. Why can't I accomplish tevilas Yadayim? If I immerse my hands in the water of the tzinar, why can't I be matar my hands through the medium of tevilas Yadayim instead of Netillas Yadayim? In that case, you don't need a keli. You're not pouring water over the hands. You're immersing your hands in water. You also don't need kayach hanoisen. There is no kayach hanoisen. We're not talking about water being poured on your hands. We're talking about immersion. So wonders the Mechaber sort of, you might think that in this case, where we said you can't do Netillas Yadayim in the waters of the tzinar, well, how about tevilas Yadayim? Why isn't that good for tevilas Yadayim? So the Mechaber says as follows. If you immerse your hands into the waters of this tzinar, they will not become tar through the medium of tevilas Yadayim. Why? Mipnei, and now we turn the page to Nun Amud Beis, Mipnei shehem she'uvim. Because we know that mayim, when we want to go to the mikveh, if you want to become tar by going to the mikveh, you need kosher mikveh water. Mayim she'uvin, which literally means drawn water, is not kosher for a mikveh. So mayim she'uvim is not kosher for tevilas Yadayim. Now, this water that we're talking about in the tzinar, how did the water get into the tzinar? The water got into the tzinar because somebody took a bucket and filled up a bucket. So this is now water that was drawn into a keli. And now he poured the water from the keli into the tzinar. Once the water was in the keli, that's mayim she'uvin. The same way mayim she'uvim don't work in a mikveh, mayim she'uvim also don't work for tevilas Yadayim. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here in Ois Kat Lamites. He says, shehem she'uvin. The problem with using the water in the tzinar for tevilas Yadayim is that it's mayim she'uvin. Ve'ein machshirin mikayach tvila. If we want to use the medium of tvila, of being toivel, immersion, in order to be matar our hands, we could only use mayim, ela b'mayim aksherid l'tvilas haguf. We could only use water that would be kosher if we were toiveling our whole body. If you want to be matar your body, you have to be toivel in a mikveh. You need mikveh water, not mayim she'uvim. V'ayel kabambas if tevzayin our Ravid makshir b'she'uvim our boim sa b'karka. The Ravid is a kiddush. He says if you have mayim she'uvim, so you fill up buckets and you pour it into a depression in the earth, and you have enough water of our boim sa, that's okay for tevilas Yadayim. Many disagree with this Ravid. Okay. So the first halakha that we just saw over here in the Mechaber, again, the Mechaber was wondering, or he's at least bavarning the kasha, why can't you use the water in the tzinar for tevilas Yadayim? Explains to Mechaber, you can't do that because since this is water that was drawn from the Ya'ar with a bucket, with a keli, and it was poured from a keli into the tzinar, this is Mayim She'uvim. And Mayim She'uvim are not kosher for tevilas Yadayim. Now, continuing on the same theme, top line, Nun Amud Beis, says the Mechaber, but, V'hani mili, when is this halacha true? B'doile, this is when somebody is drawing water with a bucket, she'shoifech v'noisein l'tzorech hatzinar atzmai. This problem only exists if you take a bucket, you draw the water, and now you pour the water directly from the bucket into the tzinar. Then it's mayim she'uvin, and you can't use it for tevilas yadayim. Aval, however, says the Mechaber, im noisen oisam chutz l'tzinar. If you pour the water onto the ground next to the tzinar. So in this scenario, what you have over here is, let's say you have a hill, and the slope is going down to the field that ultimately you want to irrigate. And you have this tzinar, you have this pipe, this half pipe, or this channel, that you're going to use to channel the water to the field. And you're taking a bucket. Now, the tzinar is all the way down on the ground, okay? So that the mouth of the tzinar is on ground level. And since there's a slope, if you pour the water onto the ground, the water will flow along the ground, enter the tzinar, and then flow by means of the tzinar. It will flow down to the field that you're trying to irrigate. This is the scenario that the Mechaber is now talking about. And he says like this, if you're not pouring the water from the bucket directly into the tzinar, instead you're pouring the water from the bucket onto the ground next to the mouth of the tzinar. And now you're directing the water to the tzinar. How are you doing that? Maybe you're making a depression in the ground. You're making a little channel in the ground. So the water, you pour the water over here. You're pouring the water over here. The water runs along the ground or the depression that you made into the ground. And then it enters the mouth of the tzinar. And then it flows to the field. In that case, says the Mechaber, and now you immerse your hands in the waters of the tzinar, tahiros. That will work for tevilas yadayim. Why? Explains the Mechaber, the she'uvim shehem shichuha, because mayim she'uvim that you pour on the ground and you let it flow on the ground for a short distance before it enters the tzibur, keshera, that water becomes kosher for tevilas yadayim. It's no longer considered mayim she'uvim. Mayim she'uvim is water that was drawn with a keli. But if you pour it from the keli directly into the tzinar, it's mayim she'uvim. But if you pour it on the ground and it flows for a short distance on the ground before it enters the tzinar, it loses the status of mayim she'uvim while it's on the ground. And now when it goes into the tzinar, you could immerse your hands into that water in the tzinar and be matfil your dayim and be mataher them through tevilas yadayim, because now it's not considered mayim she'uvim. Okay, now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and mem. In this case, what did you do? You poured the water chutz l'tzinar. You put it on the ground, not in the tzinar, before the mouth of the tzibur. Umamshich, and you allowed it to flow, or maybe you even directed it to flow into the tzinar. How long does the water have to remain on the ground in order for it to lose the status of mayim she'uvim? V'shir ha'hamshacha sheyispatel shem she'uvim al yedei zeh. The minimum amount of distance, of flow, that the water has to flow on the ground to lose the designation of mayim she'uvim, hu shloisha tvachim, is 3 tvachim, which is not that much. 1 tefach, 2 tvachim, 3 tvachim. That's not that much. A very short flow. So you pour the water onto the ground, you let it flow that much, and then it goes into the tzinar. It loses the designation of mayim she'uvim. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, umakmas atzinar atzmai loyhevi she'uvim. You might think, well, wait a second. If the water became mayim she'uvim when it was in the bucket, does it become mayim she'uvim when it's in this half pipe? Does that also make it mayim she'uvim? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Umakmas atzinar atzmai loyhevi she'uvim. The tzinar doesn't make the water mayim she'uvim. The mayim shaloi haya alav shem keli. Because we're talking about a case where this tzinar was never a keli. Kigoyin shaloi nasu by arba safais lekabel b'saychai. A tzinar, a half pipe, doesn't have four walls. It has two sides and a bottom. But if it's opened at the mouth where you pour the water in, and it's open where it terminates at the field that you want to irrigate, it's not a keli. It can't contain water. Any water put into it is going to flow out. It doesn't have a base kibel. It's not a receptacle. And therefore it's not considered a keli. So the tzinar does not make the mayim into mayim she'uvim. Mayim becomes mayim she'uvim when it's in a keli. And the tzinar is not a keli. Di'ilu haya tzinar atzmai kli. If the tzinar itself was a keli, if it was closed on the two ends, lo mahani hahamshacha, then pouring it on the water first and allowing it to flow into the tzinar wouldn't help. The tzinar itself would make it mayim she'uvim. Tahashuvin hein machmazat tzinar gufa. Vein shar sham tefillah klal. You could not do tevilas yadayim in the tzinar if the tzinar is a keli. Ois cut mem aleph shehim shichuha. You allowed the water to flow on the ground before it went into the tzinar. V'afta le'inyan tevilas haguf machmirin bazeh. Even though when it comes to tevilas haguf, if it comes to a person whose body is tar, we're not talking about being matar yadayim. If a person is actually tameh and he wants to go to the mikveh to become tar, then we're machmir. Im hayu kalamayim she'uvin af shehim shichua. We wouldn't allow this for tevilas haguf. For tevilas yadayim, we're saying all the water that's in the tzinar is mayim that was at one point mayim she'uvim. All the water in the tzinar got into the tzinar by being drawn with a bucket, being turned into mayim she'uvim, and then being poured into the tzinar. In our case, where we're saying tevilas yadayim is good, you took mayim she'uvim from the bucket, you poured it on the ground, you let it flow 3 tvachim, it lost the designation of mayim she'uvim. But all the water in the tzinar is getting into the tzinar in this fashion. So all the water in the tzinar is water that at one point in time was mayim she'uvim. Now we would not be matir that when it comes to being tevel in a mikveh. If all the water in the mikveh would be water that at one point was mayim she'uvim, and you made it ois mayim she'uvim by pouring it on the ground and letting it flow 3 tvachim, we wouldn't be matir that. So says the Mishnah Berurah, after le'inin tevilas haguf machmirin bazeh, by tevilas haguf we would be machmir. Im hayu kala mayim she'uvim, if all of the water was at one point mayim she'uvim, af she'im shichua, even if you poured it on the ground first, k'ma shekasa b'yeridei simid reish aleph. See, by a mikveh, we would only allow this with a miut of the water. We would say if roiv of the water is mei geshamim, if roiv of the water is natural water, natural rainfall, it's not mayim she'uvim, and a miut of the water is water that was mayim she'uvim, but you poured it on the ground and you let it flow into the mikveh, that we would be matir. But to use all the water in the mikveh, water that at one point in time was mayim she'uvim, and we corrected it by pouring it on the ground and letting it flow 3 tvachim, we wouldn't be matir that. Over there we would be machmir. But by netilas derabanan, by netilas yadayim, which is a derabanan, samchu lahakel al dasa matir in sham, where Saimach knows that a matir this even by tevilas haguf. Ois cut membez. So the Mechaber said, in this case, keshera. In this case, it's the mayim is kosher, since you poured it on the ground, and it lost its designation of mayim she'uvim, and you would accomplish tevilas yadayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, wait a second. There's some more requirements here. If you want to truly accomplish tevilas yadayim, there's some more requirements that the Mechaber is not mentioning over here. First of all, v'dafke sheyesh b'arba misah. It would have to be a situation where the tzinar has a capacity of 40 sa. That's the minimum size of a mikveh. So if you want to accomplish the Netillas Yadayim, you have to be immersing your hands into an amount of water of at least 40 sa. Even though later on in this Siman in Sif Yudalid, we are going to see that there are shittas that say that tevilas Yadayim you could use less than 40 sa. Not over here. Not in this case. Why? We're already employing one device, one halachic device that is a major kula. And that is, we're allowing you to take mayim that was mayim she'uvim, pour it on the ground, be mamshech it for 3 tfachim before it gets into the tzinar, and we're willing to say that it's no longer mayim she'uvim. And not only that, but like we said in the previous Mishnah Berurah, we're going to allow you to accomplish tevilas Yadayim even though all the water in the tzinar is water that at one point in time was mayim she'uvim. So we're already employing one major kula. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we're not also going to be makel and say that you could do tevilas Yadayim in less than 40 sa. So if you want to do this, you got to have a tzeder that can hold 40 sa. You also need that the water should be contained and not flowing. Now, the water in this tzinar is flowing. That's the whole point of the tzinar. It's flowing downstream from the Ar where you got the water from down to the field that needs irrigation. But says the Chavetz Chaim, if you want to use the water in the tzinar for tevilas Yadayim, it can't be zeichlin. It can't be flowing. It has to be contained water. You would have to stop up the end of the tzinar downstream so that the water stops flowing, and now the water is bechunasin, the water is contained, and then you could use it for tevilas Yadayim. Okay, now the Mishnah Berurah goes and introduces us to an even more fascinating extension of this whole halacha. Says the Mechaber like this. So far, what did we say? So far we said, you're taking water from a bucket, you're pouring it into a tzinar. You can't put your hands into the tzinar and accomplish the tevilas Yadayim. Why? Because there are 2 things you're missing. One is you don't have koyach hanoisein. The water is flowing over your hands from gravity, not mikoyach gavra. Number 2, you don't have a keli. You're dunking your hands into a tzinar. The water is not coming onto your hands from a keli. So that doesn't work. You want to dunk your hands in the into the tzinar. I keep on saying tzibur instead of tzinar. If you want to dunk your hands in the tzinar, very close to where the water lands into the tzinar from the bucket, that you could do. Why? Because since you're very close to where the water falls from the bucket into the tzinar, that's called koyach hanoisein. That's called koyach gavra. It's also called getting water from the keli. Okay. Now, could you just immerse your hands anywhere in the tzinar and accomplish tevilas Yadayim? No, you can't do that. Why? Because let's remember, the water is mayim she'uvin. The water came from a bucket. It's mayim she'uvin. Okay. Could you take the water from the bucket, pour it on the ground, and then from the ground, the water will run into the tzinor, and then use it for tevilas Yadayim? Yes. Why? Because as long as the water flows 3 tfachim on the ground before it comes into the tzinar, it loses the designation of mayim she'uvim, and now you're okay. So the case that we're saying is okay is a case where you're not pouring the water directly into the tzinar. You're pouring the water onto the ground, and from the ground is flowing into the tzinar. Now the Mechaber is going to give us another case where you could accomplish tevilas Yadayim in the tzinar, even if you pour the water directly into the tzinar. Remember, we said if you pour the water directly into the tzinar, you cannot accomplish tevilas Yadayim. Why? Because it's mayim she'uvim. Why is it mayim she'uvim? Because it came from a bucket. The bucket is a keli. So once the water went into the keli, it's mayim she'uvim. Right? We said the only way out is pour the water onto the ground. and be mamshech it on the ground for gimel tvachim, now it loses the status of mayim she'uvim. When it goes into the tzinar, it doesn't become mayim she'uvim because the tzinar is not a keli. That was the eitzah. Now the Mechaber is going to give us another case where you could accomplish tevilas yadayim in the water of the tzinar, even though you poured the water directly from the bucket into the tzinar. Let's see this case. Says the Mechaber like this. Second line down, end of the line. Last word on the line. Va'afilu doile v'noisen l'seich hachritz atzmai. There is a case where even if you draw the water with the bucket, that's va'afilu doile. Doile means to draw the water with a bucket. So there is a case where va'afilu doile, even if you draw the water with a bucket, v'noisen l'seich hachritz atzmai, and you pour the water directly into the tzinar. The chritz over here is another word for the tzinar. There's a possibility that it could be okay. What's the case? Continues the Mechaber. Im hadli nokuv me'achorov. If the bucket that you're using to collect the water from the river and pour it into the tzinar, if that bucket has a hole in the bottom, im hadli nokuv me'achorov, literally it means it has a hole in its back. In our case, that means the floor of the bucket. And how big is the hole? Bikoines mashke, that's the size of a hole that we spoke about at the beginning of the Siman, where if you would take this bucket and you would push it into water, water would penetrate from outside the bucket into the bucket. So it's a hole big enough that it would allow water to come in. Uba'oid sheshayfech derech piv latzinar. And while you're pouring water from the opening of the bucket into the tzinar, mikaleach me'achorov layaor, simultaneously, what's happening is water is leaking out from the hole in the bottom of the bucket, going back into the river, into the Ya'ar. So you understand what's going on here? You're standing on the bank of the Ya'ar, okay? You're taking a keli, you're dunking the keli into the Ya'ar, and you're filling it up. Now you're going to pour water into the tziner. The tziner is over here. You're going to pour water into the tziner. So you've got water going glug, 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 glug. You've got water coming out from the mouth over here, going into the tziner. Now the problem is that this keli is a hole at the bottom. So simultaneously, while the water is pouring from the opening of the keli into the tziner, at the same time, water is leaking out of the back of the keli, and it's flowing backwards. You've got a backflow going into the river. So guess what you have now? You know what you have now? Now you've formed a connection between the water of the river and the water of the tzinar. Why? Because you've got a flow of water going from the back of the keli into the river. So the river is connected to the water in the keli by virtue of that flow. You've got another flow of water going from the opening of the keli into the tzinar. That forms a connection from the water in the keli to the water in the tzinar. So this keli is now the middleman, but this keli is forming a connection between the water in the tzinar, the water in the keli, and the water in the river. Oh, fascinating. Says the Mechaber, in that case, matpil bayas yadayim, you could immerse your hands into the water of the tzinar, utahayrais, and you'll accomplish tevilas yadayim, and your hands are tahar. Why? Says the Mechaber, the chashivi ki'ilu hitbilam baya'or, because we don't look at it that you're immersing your hands in the water of the tzinar. We look at it that you're immersing your hands in the river. You're immersing your hands in the waters of the Ya'ar. Why? Because this flow of water that's coming from the bottom of the keli and creating a backflow into the river, choshev chibur le'inyan tefillah, that creates a connection to the water in the Ya'ar for the halachas of tevilas yadayim. That's the first sheet of the Mechaber. But then the Mechaber says, V'yesh cholkin, it brings down a riff. V'yesh cholkin bazet, there are those that disagree with this. V'ayimrim, and they say, the gamla Netillas Yadayim lo chashiv chibur, that even for Netillas Yadayim, this would not constitute a chibur. So this is fascinating. Over here, the Mechaber has given us a case where you could be pouring the water from the bucket, or from whatever keli it is, directly into the tzinar, and yet you could accomplish tevilas Yadayim in the tzinar. Why? Because since you've got water flowing from the keli into the tzinar, and simultaneously you have water backflowing from the keli into the ya'ar, it's all considered a chibur, a connection, and when you dunk your hands into the water in the tzinar, it's as if you're dunking your hands directly into the ya'ar, and you accomplish tevilas Yadayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut Mem Gimel. So this is a case where you could pour the water directly l'seich hacharitz. Ritzayin Elomer, what the Mechaber wants to say, l'seich hacharitz shel hatzinar, into the depression of the tzinar. So you're pouring the water directly into the tzinar, and it still works. And that's the case where the keli has a hole. And how big is the hole? B'koines mashka, a hole that allows water to penetrate. When you have a hole that's big enough that it goes with a continuous drip, that's koines mashka. That's a hole that's considered to be the size of koines mashka. So you hear this? According to this shita, you don't even need a steady backflow going from the keli to the river. As long as there's a steady drip, that's enough to create a connection. But v'yesh writes in Loimar, this is a shitas HaTosfos, v'yesh writes in Loimar, there are those that want to say, the bekan tzarich shia gadol tzas, over here you need a bigger hole, sheyehei nireh hakiluach, that you could have a steady flow, and it's a visible flow, a visible stream that you can see going back into the river. That's when it could constitute a connection to the river water. That would require a hole the size of a lentil. Okay. Ice cut mem hey. The Mechaber said the nitzuk zeh Mechaber hakli layar. If you've got that backflow going from the keli back into the river, while you've got the flow of water going into the tzinar, that connects the water in the keli to the water of the ya'ar. Okay. Says the Mechaber now, for hu adin, the same halacha would apply. In Baba Sfina, if you're traveling on a ship, ve'enei magia lahat bil yadav bimei hayam. You're on a ship. You want to eat your tuna fish sandwich. You don't have a keli to wash the Netillas Yadayim. Now, really, you could dunk your hands into the water of the yam. You could accomplish tevilas Yadayim by immersing your hands into the water of the yam. But you can't reach the yam. You're on the deck, and you're way too high to be able to dunk your hands into the water of the yam. Ve'ein loy kli shalem. And you don't have a whole keli that's kosher for the Netillas Yadayim. Rak kli menukiv k'koines mashka. You only have a keli that's got a hole in it of the size of koines mashka. Says Mishnah Berurah, what do you do? Doila boy minayam. Tie a string to this keli, lower it down to the yam, bring water up using this keli. Now this keli's got a hole in it, so the water is going to be flowing out of the keli back to the yam. And now umat bil yodav boy, dunk your hands into the keli, because since you've got a backflow going from the keli back down to the yam, the water in the keli is considered connected to the water of the yam. So by dunking your hands into the keli, you're dunking your hands into the yam. Because they're considered connected by virtue of the water that's leaking out of the keli back to the yam. Ois kat mem vav. This kind of connection is okay l'inyan tvila. The nitzak any chibur. 1 second. Mem vav. Yeah, the Mechaber said alpha gav the nitzak kazeh. Did I miss those words when I read the Mechaber? I'm not sure. Alpha gav the nitzak kazeh loy chashav chibur l'inyan tvila. When it comes to being tovel in a mikveh, we would never allow a connection like this to make water kosher to tovel it as a mikveh. This kind of specious connection between two bodies of water would not work for tevilas haguf. Says Mishnah Berurah, a flow like this would not create a chibur between two bodies of water. Tevilas haguf. Even when we do allow the connection of two different bodies of water in order to create a kosher mikveh, hu b'shir gadol, you need a much bigger connection. So, in other words, let's say nowadays, when you go to the mikveh, the water that you're tovel in the mikveh, that's really not the mikveh water. I mean, it is. Don't get me wrong. It is mikveh water. But that's not the mei geshamim. The mei geshamim is the bar. In the mikveh building somewhere, there's a bar, there's a pit, and there's water in there that's kosher and mikveh water. You don't want to be tovel in that water, because that water ain't too clean. What they do is they make a connection between that water and the water that you're being tovel in the nice clean mikveh. Now you can't forge a connection between those two bodies of water with a tiny little stream of water flowing between the two of them. You need a much bigger opening. You need kishfeiferes hanoid. You need an opening that's at least big enough that you could turn two fingers easily inside that opening. All right, wow. I thought I was going to get a lot further, but the next Mishnah Berurah is very complex. So I'm going to stop over here, and Mr. Hashem will continue next time with Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Mem Zayin. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah can be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshua's and Refuah's and Panas and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias called Tzedek B'meher V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.